Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, articles, biographies, and historical research and build you a direct, fast, and ultimately fascinating path to expertise.
Today, we are wrestling with a literary giant, someone whose life and work are, well, as complex and contradictory as the nation he attempted to encapsulate.
We're talking about Walter Whitman Jr.
That's right. Whitman, who lived from 1819 to 1892, is so much more than just a famous name. He's a foundational American voice.
He's often called the father of free verse, and while that's accurate, it barely scratches the surface of how truly revolutionary and how utterly controversial his impact was during his time.
It really does. The source material we've gathered for this is a comprehensive, deep dive into his biography.
We're exploring the chaos of his early life, the self-reliant publication of his magnum opus, Leaves of Grass, his turbulent time as a Civil War nurse in Washington.
And crucially, the intense complexity of his personal beliefs, from sexuality to nationalism and, yes, race.
Our mission today is to unpack this material and give you a detailed understanding of how this self-made, often despised figure earned his place at the absolute top of the literary pyramid.
The praise is just staggering. The Poetry Foundation doesn't hesitate, calling him America's world poet, a latter-day successor to Homer, Virgil, Dante, and Shakespeare.
I mean, that's quite a list.
It's the highest possible praise.
And then there's the modernist master, Ezra Pound. You know, a poet who often detested Victorian sentimentality. He offered this profound, concise summary.
America's poet. He is America.
He is America. So today we're going to explore the restless, contradictory life that led to that astonishing, sweeping assessment, starting right from his turbulent roots.
To understand the poet, you first have to understand the rough, as he called himself. Whitman was born in West Hills, New York in 1819.
He was the second of 9 children.
9, to Quaker parents of English and Dutch descent. And one of the first details we find is that he was immediately nicknamed Walt to distinguish him from his father, Walter Sr.
This early life was marked by this incredible financial insecurity, wasn't it?
Absolutely. His family lived in a constant series of homes in Brooklyn. They were perpetually moving because his father made these relentless and unfortunately unsuccessful investments in real estate.
So Whitman himself looked back on his childhood as being generally restless and deeply unhappy.
Yes, and it was all because of this perpetual financial struggle. You can really see the foundation of his empathy for the working man right there in his own experience.
And that economic pressure, it meant that his formal education ended incredibly early.
So early. The sources really emphasize this. He walked away from traditional schooling at age 11.
Not by choice, though.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was because he had to find employment to help his struggling family survive. This necessity really shaped his self-taught, self-made identity.
So what did that initial grind look like? I mean, it sounds like a true 19th century apprenticeship.
It was. His very first jobs included serving as an office boy for lawyers. And then he became an apprentice, or printer's devil as they called it, for a weekly newspaper called The Patriot.
The printer's devil.
That experience, as the errand boy and often the lowest worker in the shop, was perhaps the most consequential part of his education.
How so?
Well, it's where he learned about the inner workings of the printing press, how to set type by hand, and how to physically manifest words into permanent print.
So these weren't just jobs.
No, these were the technical skills he would later use to literally print his own revolutionary book. It's an incredible through line.
It is a powerful connection. The poet who would break all the rules was, at his core, a craftsman of the printed word. But before we get to all that chaos, there is one small, almost perfect memory from his childhood that really stands out.
Yes, the legendary meeting with the Marquis de Lafayette.
Right. So July 4th, 1825, Lafayette was in Brooklyn for the cornerstone setting of the Brooklyn Apprentices Library.
And while they were celebrating, the Revolutionary War hero apparently lifted 6-year-old Walt in the air and kissed him on the cheek. Whitman recalled this moment later as a genuinely happy memory.
A moment of connection to the spirit of American Revolution.
Exactly. And almost poetically, Whitman later came full circle, actually working as a librarian at that very institution, the Brooklyn Apprentices Library.
The boy, embraced by revolutionary history at an institution dedicated to learning, it's just the perfect symbolic start for the self-proclaimed poet of democracy.
But the path to that destiny was incredibly messy. He leaves Brooklyn at 16, tries to make it as a compositor in New York City.
And he immediately hits these severe financial roadblocks.
Right. First, a devastating fire sweeps through the printing district, which wipes out a lot of the work.
And then the economy collapses.
Exactly. The general economic collapse leading up to the infamous Panic of 1837 hits him hard.
So this financial instability just keeps forcing him back to Long Island. He taught intermittently at various schools between 1836 and 1838, and again later.
Our sources are clear on this. He found teaching deeply unsatisfying.
Which led him to his next hustle, media ownership.
He literally tried to be his own newspaper boss. He founded his own paper in Huntington, New York called the Long Islander.
And when you say he ran it, you mean he ran it.
I mean, he was everything. The publisher, the editor, the press man, the distribution manager, and the home delivery boy.
That level of personal, physical labor in the service of written communication is extraordinary.
It is. But, true to his restless nature, he sold the paper after only 10 months. He simply couldn't settle.
He kept bouncing around, working for the Long Island Democrat, and then he edited the Aurora in 1842. But his most significant and maybe most stable journalistic job was editing the Brooklyn Eagle from 1846 to 1848.
Yes, and it's here, while working a standard journalism job, that the seed of his poetic revolution was truly planted.
This is where it gets really interesting because the connection is so counterintuitive. What does a hard-nosed, working-class Brooklyn editor have to do with the, highly refined world of Italian opera?
Everything, apparently. While reviewing performances for the Brooklyn Eagle, Whitman became an absolute devotee of Italian opera.
The big dramatic works.
Exactly. Bellini, Donizetti, and Verdi. He was obsessed with the dramatic range, the structure, and the emotional resonance.
And he later stated, very explicitly, but for the opera, I could never have written Leaves of Grass. That's a phenomenal claim.
It is.
So how did he translate the experience of Italian opera into the creation of free verse poetry?
Well, think about the nature of opera. It's grand, it's expansive, it tells a huge, messy, universal story using these long, sweeping, melodic lines that they disregard the rigid structure of a traditional song.
Okay, I can see that.
Whitman's free verse did the same thing. The cadences, the almost breathless lisp-making, the rhetorical amplitude, the sheer length of his lines, it all mirrored the rhythmic and narrative architecture of those grand Italian librettos.
He was creating a literary form designed for the American continent, but he was echoing the musical and emotional scale he found in the opera house.
He traded meter and rhyme for dramatic rhythm. That's a fascinating insight.
But his time at the Brooklyn Eagle, which introduced him to this world, it ended abruptly in 1848 because of politics.
Specifically, the turbulent debate over the expansion of slavery.
Right. So Whitman sided with the anti-slavery, free soil barn burner wing of the Democratic Party.
And to understand this, you need a little context.
Yeah.
The Free Soilers weren't abolitionists in the, purely moral sense. They opposed extending slavery into new territories, primarily because they saw it as a threat to free white labor.
Because slave labor would artificially depress wages and hurt the livelihood of northern businessmen and workers.
Exactly. So when we call him a poet of democracy, we have to acknowledge that his foundation for anti-slavery sentiment was often one of economic self-interest, not pure moral conviction.
It's a key distinction.
It highlights the constant tension in Whitman's life between the sublime egalitarian ideal and the pragmatic, often self-interested reality of American politics.
And the owner of the Eagle, Isaac Van Anden, was on the other side.
Completely. He was a conservative hunker, a wing of the party that essentially hunkered down to preserve the status quo. Whitman's radical faction was willing to burn down the barn, the Democratic Party itself, to prevent slavery's expansion. This political rift cost him his job.
So before he fully committed to poetry, there was one more strange professional detour in 1858 that just feels almost hilariously out of place.
Yes, the pseudoscientific health tract. He published Manly Health and Training under the rather amusing pen name Mose Velsor.
Which was a nod to his mother's family name, Van Velsor.
That's the one.
I have to admit, reading this in the sources, the man who would revolutionize American poetry was also penning self-help advice that modern writers have called quirky, so over the top, and just wacky.
And the advice was incredibly prescriptive and bizarrely specific. He recommended growing a beard, which he certainly did, taking daily cold water baths, getting up early.
And nude sunbathing.
And nude sunbathing. But perhaps the most enduringly strange piece of advice was his radical diet. He advocated eating meat almost exclusively, dismissing vegetables as offering little to no real strength.
It's just astonishing that this mixture of Democratic manifesto, journalistic hustle, and wacky self-help preceded his literary breakthrough.
It really shows the incredible chaotic energy he channeled into everything he did.
And that chaotic energy finally found its singular focus. Which brings us to Section 2, the revolutionary text Leaves of Grass and the birth of the American epic.
After years of chasing what he called the usual rewards in journalism and fiction, Whitman decided to fully transform into the poet he believed America needed.
He consciously intended to write a distinct American epic, something that broke entirely from the European poetic tradition.
He chose free verse, but the surprising source of his rhythm was, ironically, the King James Bible. He used its long, parallel cadences to ground his revolutionary lines.
And the very nature of the first edition in 1855 tells the story of this self-made prophet. This was a completely self-reliant venture.
Entirely. Whitman financed the publication himself. He had the 795 copies printed at a local print shop in Brooklyn.
Often using the downtime.
Exactly, during employee breaks from commercial jobs. This meant he didn't just write the book. He was involved in the physical, messy labor of producing it, which recalls his days as a printer's devil.
And the cover was a deliberate statement. It completely lacked an author's name on the title page.
Instead, there was this incredibly rugged, engraved portrait of Whitman, hands casually tucked into his trousers, wearing his hat indoors, a true image of one of the roughs.
His identity was deliberately submerged into the text, only emerging some 500 lines into the dominant poem. And when he revealed himself, it was a manifesto.
Oh, absolutely. He called himself Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos, disorderly, fleshly, and sensual, no sentimentalist, no stander above men or women or apart from him, no more modest than immodest.
That declaration is a total rejection of Victorian politeness and a full embrace of the physical, messy, democratic American experience.
The inaugural volume contained this enormous 827-line prose preface, basically a theoretical treatise on American poetry and 12 untitled poems.
And it was dominated by the 336 lines that would later be titled Song of Myself.
Song of Myself was, and it remains, a revolutionary text. It assumes the identity of every single person in the United States. The laborer, the prostitute, the rich, the poor, the oppressed, the oppressor.
He uses that encompassing I to literally sing America into existence. The sheer scope was unprecedented.
It was.
What's truly fascinating here is the immediate validation he received from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was arguably the most influential literary figure in America at the time.
Emerson, the great champion of American transcendentalism, had been calling for years for the first truly American poet to emerge, free of English constraint.
And when he read Leaves of Grass,
he was completely captivated. He wrote Whitman a 5-page flattering letter, calling the book the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. For Emerson, Whitman had finally fulfilled his call.
And Whitman, the former editor, the natural hustler, he saw this as the ultimate marketing opportunity. This is where he pioneers the modern cover blurb in a move that was both audacious and completely unauthorized.
It was a masterstroke of self-promotion. Whitman took one line from Emerson's private letter, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career," and embossed it in glorious, attention-grabbing gold leaf right onto the spine of the second edition.
And you have to put this in context. In 1856, this kind of commercialized use of a private endorsement was absolutely unheard of. It was crass, it was journalistic, and it was brilliant.
He leveraged the prestige of the literary establishment to advertise a book that much of that establishment was about to label as filth.
Because despite Emerson's praise, the book stirred up significant controversy.
Oh, a huge amount. It was criticized fiercely for its obscene nature and its overt, unabashed sensuality. The language about the body, about sexuality, about physical intimacy, it shocked polite society.
And the reactions were vicious. We have the account of a geologist, Peter Leslie, writing to Emerson, basically begging him not to praise the book.
He called it trashy, profane, and obscene, and labeled Whitman himself a pretentious ass.
The publisher was terrified. The second edition, which included 20 additional poems, almost wasn't released because of the uproar over the sexual themes.
But Whitman was relentless.
Yeah.
He believed the body was sacred and that poetry must speak truthfully about life in all its messy totality.
And this wasn't a static project for him. He didn't just publish it once and move on.
Not at all. He spent the entire rest of his life expanding and revising this one central work. We see new editions rolling out in 1860, 1867, 1871, 1876, 1881.
And finally, the capstone deathbed edition in 1889, 1891.
It truly was an evolving, living document, reflecting his changing perspective on America, his health, and his poetic goals.
Yet, despite the enormous literary buzz and the controversy, none of this translated into financial stability for him.
Not in the slightest. Whitman had constant financial difficulties during this era, which forced him back into the journalistic hack work he supposedly left behind. He edited Brooklyn's Daily Times from 1857 to 1859.
It just shows that even the self-proclaimed poet prophet of America couldn't escape the daily grind. His career before the Civil War was defined by this brutal tension between artistic genius and the reality of poverty. That precarious lifestyle and that internal artistic struggle changed dramatically with the outbreak of the American Civil War, which brings us to Section 3, War, Washington, and the Decline of the Body.
The war didn't just change America. It completely redefined Walt Whitman. At the start of the conflict, he was actively involved. He published his poem, Beat, Drums.
Which was a highly patriotic rally call for the Union cause, wasn't it? Urging citizens to abandon their daily lives for the necessity of war.
Yes. But the catalyst for his move south and his transition to a wartime volunteer was deeply personal. It was driven by a fear that every family with a soldier faced.
His brother, George, had joined the Union Army.
Indeed. And in December 1862, Whitman saw a listing of casualties in the New York Tribune that he feared was his brother, listed as First Lieutenant G.W. Whitmore.
So he immediately dropped everything and rushed south.
He had a rough journey. He even had his wallet stolen along the way. But thankfully, he found George alive.
Just a superficial wound.
A superficial cheek wound, yes. But the journey itself and what he saw at the hospitals and battle sites fundamentally altered his trajectory.
He was profoundly affected by the massive scale of human suffering.
He wrote so vividly about it, seeing the endless procession of wounded men, and perhaps most viscerally, witnessing the heaps of their amputated limbs. The shock of the war's physical reality was such that he never returned to New York to live permanently.
He moves to Washington, D.C., and immediately begins volunteering as a nurse in the Army hospitals.
And this wasn't a paid position. This was a humane, deeply personal service. He ministered to somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 wounded or sick soldiers during the war.
Bringing them small comforts, reading to them, writing letters home for them.
He detailed this work vividly, often at his own expense, in his writing. His accounts, like The Great Army of the Sick, published in 1863, and his later book, Memoranda During the War.
They provide some of the most moving, ground-level accounts of the Civil War's impact on the individual body. This experience really became the crucible for his mature work.
It did. But as a volunteer, he still needed to eat. So his friends helped him secure temporary employment?
Right. He got part-time work in the Army Paymaster's office, and then in 1865, he secured a better-paying, low-grade clerkship in the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
But that government stability was short-lived. On June 30th, 1865, he was fired by the new Secretary of the Interior, a former senator named James Harlan.
And while Harlan claimed it was because Whitman's attendance was sporadic, the prevailing belief among historians is that Harlan fired Whitman purely on moral grounds.
That's right.
On moral grounds. Was this related to his poetry?
Yes. The suspicion is that Harlan, a conservative moralist, found a copy of the explicit 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass in Whitman's desk.
And for a government clerk to be writing what Harlan viewed as obscene poetry was, for him, grounds for dismissal.
And this political or moral persecution instantly turned the poet into a cause célèbre.
His friend, William Douglas O'Connor, reacted instantly and furiously. O'Connor secured Whitman a transfer to the Attorney General's office, so he kept a job, but O'Connor didn't let the moral argument lie.
No, he published an aggressive, though highly biased, defense of Whitman in January 1866 called The Good Gray Poet.
And this pamphlet successfully reframed Whitman's image.
Completely. It moved him away from the controversial rough and repositioned him as this wholesome, patriotic, long-suffering man of principle, the Good Gray Poet.
And that nickname stuck, increasing his popularity tremendously and changing his public perception almost overnight.
The public was already primed to appreciate this image, largely due to his work following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, whom Whitman deeply admired.
His elegies for Lincoln really cemented his role as America's national voice in tragedy. He authored two iconic poems, "O Captain, My Captain," and "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed."
And it's an interesting detail that "O Captain, My Captain" was highly conventional in its form. It used meter and rhyme, a stark contrast to his free verse.
That conventionality made it accessible and popular, and it became his only poem to appear in anthologies during his lifetime, which contributed significantly to his fame.
Meanwhile, his reputation was expanding globally. Poems of Walt Whitman was published in England in 1868 and became immensely popular,
Largely thanks to the enthusiastic endorsement of the respected English writer Anne Gilchrist.
who became a lifelong admirer and eventually even traveled to America to meet him.
But just as his fame stabilized, his body began to fail. In 1873, he suffered a paralytic stroke.
That forced him to move from Washington, D.C. to Camden, New Jersey to live with his brother George. And his mother died that same year, compounding his physical and emotional distress.
He was forced into decline, but his drive remained. He eventually managed to buy his own small home in Camden in 1884 at 328 Mickle Street.
He was often bedridden, relying on his housekeeper, Mary Oakes Davis, who was the widow of a sea captain. She lived with him in exchange for free rent.
And the sources paint this beautiful, eccentric picture of his final years there, living with Davis and her menagerie of pets, a cat, a dog, 2 turtle doves, a canary.
It's a quiet, domestic end for the chaotic American prophet.
And he used this time for his final artistic dedication. He spent his final years polishing and perfecting his great work.
The sources highlight the profound, almost religious, emotional significance of that final collection, the deathbed edition. He considered it at last complete after 33 years of hackling at it, all times and moods of my life, fair weather and foul, all parts of the land, and peace and war, young and old.
He prepared for death with the same attention he gave to his book, commissioning this massive granite mausoleum shaped like a house for $4,000.
Which he visited frequently during its construction.
When he died on March 26, 1892, at age 72, the autopsy revealed the truth of his suffering. His lungs were operating at only 1/8 capacity due to bronchial pneumonia, and an egg-sized abscess had eroded one of his ribs.
His death was a major civic event. The public viewing drew over 1,000 visitors in 3 hours, with flowers covering his coffin. His funeral at Harley Cemetery was a large public ceremony.
With the famous orator Robert Ingersoll delivering the eulogy.
But here is the truly bizarre footnote to his end. His brain was donated to the American Anthropometric Society in Philadelphia for study.
But the sources report that it was accidentally destroyed.
Yes, the man who embodied the American soul, whose life was one of artistic chaos, had his final physical remnant destroyed through, well, a bureaucratic mistake.
The irony is profound.
The brain that birthed the American epic was lost before it could be studied. It's a final, powerful symbol of the chaotic genius he represented.
That biography sets an incredibly complex stage for Section 4, unpacking the beliefs controversy, contradictions, and the individual. Whitman wasn't just a literary stylist. He was a self-styled prophet, and his beliefs were frequently at war with each other.
His entire poetic theory was fundamentally symbiotic. He defined the goal of the American writer in the preface to Leaves of Grass, saying, "The proof of a poet is that his country absorbs him as affectionately as he has absorbed it."
And his approach involved an idiosyncratic treatment of the body and the soul, creating an epic that assumed the identity of the common person and responded directly to the rapidly urbanizing, expanding nation.
Let's start with a seemingly minor contradiction,
Yeah.
alcohol. He was an incredibly vocal proponent of temperance, even writing a wildly successful, sensationalist temperance novel called Franklin Evans.
Right, back in 1842, and he often argued vehemently for prohibition.
And yet, years later, he completely flip-flopped. He expressed deep embarrassment over Franklin Evans, calling it damned rot and dismissing it entirely.
And the irony is, he claimed he wrote the entire novel in 3 days just for the money.
And that he wrote it while under the influence of alcohol himself. Later in life, he became quite liberal, openly enjoying local wines and champagne.
That flip-flop suggests that his public moralizing, especially early in his career, was often disconnected from his private life, or was driven purely by the need to hustle for cash.
Exactly. He was writing to the market, even if it contradicted his future beliefs.
And when we look at his relationship with religion, we find a similar kind of tension.
We do. He was deeply influenced by deism, the belief in a creator God who does not interfere, and he embraced all religions equally. In Song Myself and With Antecedents, he states he respects and accepts every faith.
I adopt each theory, myth, god, and demigod. I see that the old accounts, Bibles, genealogies are true without exception.
That sounds broadly spiritual, but was he, say, a practicing Christian?
No. And the crucial nuance is that he was a religious skeptic. He accepted all churches and believed in the inherent divinity of humanity, but he believed in none of them exclusively.
His concept of God was pantheist or pandeist, that God is both immanent, so within the world, and transcendent beyond it. He completely rejected the concept of God as separate from creation.
And he firmly believed the soul was immortal and constantly developing, not fixed by one creed.
Right.
Now let's move to the ultimate ongoing debate, his sexuality. This is framed by biographers as incredibly complex, acknowledging the absence of definitive proof, but relying heavily on the textual and anecdotal evidence provided by the sources.
And he is generally described as homosexual or bisexual in his feelings and attractions.
His poetry treated love and sexuality in an extremely earthy, individualized way. And it's essential to understand this was before the late 19th century process known as the medicalization of sexuality.
That's a key point. Before that, intense same-sex friendship was culturally accepted, if not always understood. But once sexuality started being categorized as a disease or deviance by the medical establishment, the cultural stakes changed radically.
And we have compelling textual evidence for this. The sources note that a manuscript of Once I Passed Through a Populous City, written when he was 29, indicates it was originally about his intense feeling for a man.
Before he revised it to be about a woman for publication.
Which is significant. The man was always present in the poetry, even when he felt he had to hide it.
And beyond the text, our sources detail several intense, intimate relationships with men that strongly suggest sexual or deep emotional and romantic bonds.
Who are the key figures here?
Well, the most famous is likely Peter Doyle, a bus conductor Whitman met around 1866 in Washington, D.C. They were inseparable for years.
And Doyle recalled that their connection was instantaneous.
He said, "We were familiar at once. I put my hand on his knee. We understood." The emotional depth is undeniable. Whitman even coded Doyle's initials numerically in his private notebooks as 16.4.
The sources mention others as well.
Yes. There is Bill Duckett, a young man who lived with Whitman for a number of years in Camden. A striking photograph of the two men is described by biographers as being modeled on the conventions of a marriage portrait.
Suggesting they intentionally encrypted their male-male desire in a public image.
And then there was Harry Stafford, a youth Whitman, met in 1876. They exchanged rings during their stormy relationship, and Stafford wrote about that ring to Whitman, saying, "There was but one thing to part it from me, and that was death."
These details, taken together, they point to deeply intimate, emotional, and potentially physical partnerships.
They do, yet the historical record is profoundly complicated by Whitman's own denial late in life, particularly when he was corresponding with the English poet and critic John Addington Symonds.
Symonds, who was himself keenly interested in classical male love, directly asked whether Whitman's Calamus poems implied semisexual emotions and actions between men.
And Whitman issued an extremely explicit and vehement denial. He called the suggestion terrible and damnable.
So why the sudden, fierce rejection of something his poetry had celebrated for decades?
This is where that historical context of the medicalization of sexuality is so vital. By the 1880s, European doctors and thinkers were beginning to categorize same-sex desire as a definable pathological deviance.
So for Whitman, who was trying to cement his legacy as the good gray poet, a public association with what was fast becoming labeled as sexual pathology would have been ruinous.
Ruinous to his reputation and his book's survival. His denial was really a desperate act of self-protection against newly forming social stigma.
It's a tragic contradiction. The poet of radical acceptance publicly rejects the very identity he lived and celebrated privately.
And to fully seal that denial, he insisted, without any corroboration, that he had conceived 6 illegitimate children.
Scholars are almost universally skeptical of that claim about the children, viewing it as a clear attempt to provide a heterosexual alibi.
But the complexity doesn't end there, as he did have known relationships with women. He noted a romantic friendship with an actress, Ellen Gray, whom he referred to as an old sweetheart of mine.
So, as one biographer, Jerome Loving, acknowledges, the discussion of Whitman's sexual orientation will continue regardless of new evidence, because the contradictions were just embedded in the man himself.
And moving from sex to politics, the contradictions become even more fraught when discussing his views on race and nationalism. He is celebrated as the champion of democracy, yet our sources reveal deeply flawed, even racist views.
He certainly opposed the extension of slavery. We saw that with the barn burners. But again, he did so largely because it threatened free white labor and northern economics.
And initially, he vehemently opposed abolitionism, calling their methods ultraism and officiousness. His core argument was that abolitionists were destabilizing the nation and disrupting democratic order.
And the sources indicate his prejudice was far more direct than just political strategy.
It was explicit. David Reynolds notes that Whitman openly subscribed to the prevailing white prejudice that free African Americans should not vote.
He even wrote in prejudiced terms about black legislators, shockingly referring to them as blacks with about as much intellect and caliber as so many baboons.
It's hard to read.
So, given these deep-seated prejudices, how can scholars consistently champion him as the poet of equality? This is the central puzzle.
It truly is. The critic Nathaniel O'Reilly argues that Whitman's imagined America is arrogant, expansionist, hierarchical, racist, and exclusive. He failed to consistently reconcile the ingrained racist character of the United States with the transcendent egalitarian ideals he espoused in his poetry.
He was a product of his time, with all its inherent flaws.
But, and this is the key that unlocks his legacy, despite the author's personal prejudices, the radically democratic and egalitarian nature embedded in the poetry itself served as a universal transcendent model.
So the Song of Myself encompasses everyone, regardless of skin color or class, and that structure, that expansive vision, was taken up by democratic poets of all backgrounds.
The art achieved an idealism that the flawed author himself never consistently embodied.
We do see glimpses of more progressive thought, however. He did exhibit some complexity in external policy. In 1864, he wrote that Mexico was the only country to whom we have ever really done wrong,
Acknowledging American expansionist guilt, and he argued that the indigenous and Spanish Indian elements would supply leading traits in the future composite American identity.
So it shows he was constantly wrestling, constantly negotiating the ugly reality of 19th century America with the sublime utopian vision of democracy he was creating on the page.
His life was a microcosm of the very contradictions and tensions that define the American experiment.
That complexity leads us into our final section, Section 5, the enduring echoes Whitman's massive global legacy. Despite, or perhaps because of, his contradictions, he is cemented as America's national poet.
Reflecting the civilization up to date, as he might say, the praise continues to this day. The literary critic Harold Bloom called him the imaginative father and mother of Americans and the poet-prophet of the American religion.
Some early hyperbolic admirers even speculated that people would one day celebrate the birth of Walt Whitman as they are now the birth of Christ.
To put it mildly. And his poetic DNA flows directly through the last century and a half of American literature. Even the modernists who were trying to break with everything that came before had to deal with him.
Ezra Pound is the best example. Pound initially detested Whitman's expansive, formless style, but in his famous 1913 poem, A Pact, Pound acknowledges his debt.
He writes, "I make truce with you, Walt Whitman. I have detested you long enough. I come to you as a grown child who has had a pig-headed father. I am old enough now to make friends."
It's a formal recognition that you cannot write American poetry without first reckoning with Whitman.
And his vagabond lifestyle and revolutionary spirit directly influenced the 20th century. He was a literary hero to Langston Hughes, whose own poem, I Too Sing America, is a direct response and extension of Whitman's vision.
His embrace of the rough and the bohemian influenced the entire beat movement, figures like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, who saw Whitman as the great American outsider poet.
Anti-war poets like Adrienne Rich also credited his spirit. And crucially, June Jordan praised him specifically for creating a democratic poetic vessel whose very structure speaks to ethnic minorities from all backgrounds.
And his reach is truly global, extending far beyond the Anglosphere.
In Latin America, his influence began with the Cuban nationalist José Martí in 1887 and spread to giants like César Vallejo, Pablo Neruda, and the Argentine master Jorge Luis Borges.
In Europe, figures like Oscar Wilde and the English socialist Edward Carpenter saw him as a prophet not only of a utopian democratic future, but specifically of same-sex desire.
The deep passion of comrades. They aligned his work with their own emerging visions of societal change.
And then there's the incredible, almost bizarre anecdote about Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula.
Yes, Stoker was an admirer of Whitman and corresponded with him. He actually used the poet as one of the models for the character of Dracula, seeing him as representing a certain kind of primal, quintessential, expansive male energy.
Whitman's work permeates the arts beyond the page. His poetry has been set to music by over 500 composers,
which rivals the attention given to Emily Dickinson among American poets. This includes major figures like Leonard Bernstein, Benjamin Britten, and Ralph Vaughan Williams, who based his colossal A Sea Symphony on Whitman's texts.
And modern adaptations continue to explore his legacy. There's the 2015 opera Crossing, which was directly inspired by his Civil War diaries.
And in 2014, a German publisher released a bilingual audiobook of The Children of Adam cycle, featuring a complete reading by Iggy Pop.
The voice of punk rock, reading the father of American verse, that's a potent cultural connection.
He is inescapable in popular culture as well. We see his influence in film and TV. He is referenced in the classic film Dead Poets Society.
Where Robin Williams' teacher character uses Whitman's democratic spirit to inspire his students to carpe diem.
And Ray Bradbury's short story, I Sing the Body Electric, based on Whitman's 1855 poem, was adapted for The Twilight Zone and, perhaps most famously, used for the showcase finale in the 1980 movie Fame.
Finally, his name is everywhere, from a crater on Mercury to countless schools and roads. But the recognition isn't always smooth. The most prominent namesake is the Walt Whitman Bridge.
The one connecting Philadelphia and New Jersey. And the naming of that bridge faced significant opposition from local citizens. Our sources indicate that opponents specifically criticized his work for sympathizing with communist ideals and, ironically, criticized him for his egalitarian view of humanity, a view that was, for some mid-century Americans, simply too inclusive.
Yet, despite those lingering controversies, his place in modern cultural history is cemented. His induction into the Legacy Walk in Chicago in 2013 celebrated LGBT history,
Which firmly affirms a crucial part of his legacy, the celebration of love and comradeship, that he himself felt compelled to deny during his own lifetime.
So what does this all mean for you as you carry this knowledge forward? We've traced the incredible trajectory of Walt Whitman, from the struggling printer's devil who quit school at 11, to the chaotic journalist, the controversial Civil War nurse, and finally, the poet who redefined verse with his self-published, intensely personal American epic.
We've highlighted the profound contradictions that define him. The champion of equality who struggled with deep-seated racial prejudice and economic self-interest, the intensely sensual poet who vehemently denied any semi-sexual emotions in his relationships with men.
And the democratic idealist whose work was labeled obscene but inspired freedom across the globe.
He was a man who absorbed America completely, its beauty, its chaos, its hypocrisy, and its profound promise.
Yeah.
The revolutionary structure he gifted to the world of literature provided a vessel for every future voice, regardless of the flaws of the man who created it.
This leaves us with one final, provocative thought for you to carry forward from this deep dive. The discussion about Whitman's deeply contradictory views on race and nationalism, paired with his immense influence on democratic poets of all backgrounds, including those he personally harbored prejudice against, raises this crucial question. How can a work of art, once separated from the flawed biography of its creator, achieve a purity of democratic idealism that the author himself never consistently embodied?